Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth installment in our author speaker series. Tonight's author is Miss Mary Elizabeth Summer, the suspense writer and author of Trust Me, I'm Lying. If you weren't able to participate in last week's chat, I urge you to go watch it on our YouTube channel. Tonight, Miss Summer will be covering characters and dialogue. If you have any questions, please send them to our Twitter account at Impact Writers HQ, and we will ask Miss Summer the questions later on. So, without any further ado, the fantastic Mary Elizabeth Summer. Miss Summer, unfortunately, I can't hear you at the moment.
Okay, that's weird. Okay, so can you guys hear me now?
Yes, Miss Summer, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm just gonna go to my Mac again. Sorry, but my PC doesn't seem to be working with it for some reason. It doesn't like it. Darn it! I have another presentation that I was all excited to show you guys. Ah, I'm gonna work this out somehow. We'll figure it out. Um, okay. Well, what we're talking about today is character and dialogue. Just a little bit about me again, in case there's anybody new this time. I'm a debut author. My book, Trust Me, I'm Lying, is coming out in October. So I'm a mystery author. I write young adult, and that is sort of my area of expertise that I'm coming from. So what we're talking about today is how to create compelling characters. Hold on just a moment. I'm going to get rid of my dog. Ouch. Okay. Sorry. How to reveal character over time, how to change character for a satisfying ending, and do's and don'ts of dialogue specifically. So I'm kind of going at this from two different approaches. The first being, if you do have an idea for a character, you already have this idea for the protagonist, and he or she is just like leapt into your mind, fully formed, but you want to more explore that person before you really start writing the story from which they're going to lead the charge. So the three things you want to keep in mind about your protagonist are what their major internal wound is, what makes them special, like what maybe they have a special skill or something like that, and always keep in mind agency. If you write a book about somebody who has no ability to act, it's going to be a little bit of a boring story, which is why you see a lot of young adult novels where the parents are out of the picture. Either they're dead or they're missing or they're this or they're that. Because if parents can step in, then sort of what's the point of your character being a free agent? And sometimes, characters might be, or parents might be present, but the character is keeping things from them or they're trying to explore on their own. So that's something to keep in mind with characters. Going back to the wound thing for a minute, generally you want them to not, when you have a character, you kind of are starting them out in their normal world, but you don't want their normal world to be perfect, because if their normal world is perfect, then there's not much you can do, you can work with that. You want them to be working out some kind of internal drama while they're going through the plot arc, which is more of the external emphasis. So you kind of want to blend the two for the most satisfying story. In the case of my book, I start with Julep having a skill. She is a con artist, and so that's kind of what makes her special. And it really informs all of her decisions and how she does things, and how she delves into her world and how she decides to move on in that way. So a super secret author trick for me is Scrivener again. One of the great things about Scrivener is that it has a whole section for characters, and it has a template you can use for each character, wherein it gives you like what is their physical attributes, what are their habits or their mannerisms, what other notes, background do they have, and it gives you a place where you can post a picture of them, and that you have in your mind that maybe you've scrounged from the internet or something. So you kind of have this place, this repository for all of your characters. It's like a character Bible, if you will. And if that's not enough, or if you don't have Scrivener, you can create your own character Bible, which I also do. And I had a nice picture to show you, but that will be in the presentation that I sent to Alexis to send to all of you. And that is like, again, an Excel spreadsheet, because I love Excel. And you can have anything in it that you want, like what their full name is. For me, like which book they appear in, since I'm writing a series, I need to know, like, to kind of keep an eye on, what parts of the story they show up in. And it also helps me for minor characters, so I don't reuse names, because I am a big name reuser. So I keep a list of even like the piddly people that show up just as a walk-on. I keep a list of their names so I don't reuse that name. I also put relationships to other characters in there, and any physical attributes, any little little tics that they have, like Sam in the book, he rubs his ear when he's thinking really hard, and that's kind of a little, not cliche, but it's like, you don't want to use it too much, but it's something that for me represents Sam, and if readers read closely, they can kind of see it woven throughout. So. One thing, though, do not get caught up in the character Bible. A lot of people, especially beginning writers, tend to marinate too long in the character creation process. I am so guilty of that as well. They're like, oh, let me write this entire backstory for the character in great detail. It becomes like a book length itself. You don't want to get too wrapped up in it, because 90% of that stuff's not going to matter anyway in your actual forward story, and you're just wasting time. And the more time you waste, the more chance that somebody else is going to write your book, and lots of somebody's write your book, and then you're kind of tapped out, and the market isn't where it's at, where you think that it could be when you had the idea. So you just got to balance that, putting in enough development effort with actually moving on with the important part, which is writing the story. So from the next angle, the lack of spark. What if you don't have a protagonist just waiting in the wings, like all of a sudden popping into your head fully formed? What if instead you have a plot that you wanted to explore, or a situation or a setting, or maybe even an antagonist, but no protagonist? If you're coming at your story idea from any of those angles, you're like, oh, how do I get the protagonist that's going to be interesting enough to, take us all the way through the story without being, just an empty vessel. I don't want it to be like a, everyman character that's just sort of like walking us through the milieu of the setting. Definitely don't want to be guilty of that. So what I do in situations where I don't have an idea for a character is I do patterning, or I do mashup. That's kind of my words that I came up for what I do. But for patterning, you can pick a person that you know, or a person that you see even just walking down the street, and pattern your character sort of after them. And you don't have to know a person really well to do this. It's more about like, when you kind of see a person, you're like, wow, I could invent a whole life story for them just based on one look. That's really true, I think, even more so when you see somebody physically, because you just sort of there's a lot that informs us about a person that we're not even cognizant of when we're looking at them. So like the way they dress, the way they move, the way they flip their hair over their shoulder, or how you just have a sense of a person without even talking to them. And so in that way you can like build a whole character based on somebody you only see just in passing. And that's sort of an easy way to like glom onto something real and make it more a real protagonist. For mashup, I like to pick a person from history, historical figure, or from another story or a myth, and plop them into my plot. So if I have like this great idea for a plot, but my protagonist is kind of weak, I might try and mash it up with some kind of historical retelling of something. So like a good example might be, so I read the book, now I'm going to blank on the name, by Leon Uris, Exodus, that's what it's called, and I loved it. It's a great book, and there's a character in it named Dov Landau, and he is a survivor of the ghetto, basically, and he does a lot to try and help people get out of the Warsaw Ghetto from, this is from World War II. And so I sort of based my character Danny off of him. And Danny is not from Poland. She's from Ukraine. But she has a lot of physical characteristics in common with him, and she also has a lot of backstory in common with him. So, I sort of mashed that up so that I could have, an idea of a character in my head while I was building Danny. So that's kind of what I do there. A super secret author trick I have is Pinterest. Pinterest is a fabulous place for finding character pictures. People have entire boards devoted to characters, and you'd be amazed, again, just by looking at a person, how you could create entire stories about them that you would never have thought of without actually seeing their face. So I highly recommend Pinterest. I have a ton of boards. Feel free to follow me on Pinterest if you want. I have a board for Trust Me I'm Lying, which has pictures of people from the internet, models and such, that I found that really represented to me who the Trust Me I'm Lying characters were. So if you want to see an example, you can go look at and I of course linked to it in my presentation. I'll put the link in the handout so that you guys can see it. Okay. So another thing that you can use when you're creating characters is archetypes. there are several things to keep in mind with archetypes, though. Well, I'll tell you the good part first. The great thing about using, well, let me explain what archetypes are first. Maybe that's a good idea. Archetypes are people that we sort of think of in a general sense. They're almost roles more than they are actual people. So a good example is the wise guru or leader, sort of an archetype of a character, kind of like an Obi-Wan Kenobi, Star Wars again, Obi-Wan Kenobi sort that is like a person who knows more than we do and leads us to the next stage of the action, whatever it is, because they have greater understanding of the world than we do. So that's an example of an archetype character. And we can lean on those when we're building protagonists to sort of help guide us through, like, okay, if this person is sort of fulfilling that archetypal role, what kinds of things might they say? What kinds of, what kind of a voice might they have when they're conveying such and such information? And how do I do that in such a way that it's fresh and original? And, so you can kind of lean on our archetypes that way. The reason that they're good is that a lot of people identify with them. It's part of our collective unconscious as a species. We really tap into the hero, the wise guru, as I said. All of those archetypes, we really automatically sort of sink into them. They're part of our recurring themes from our own mythology, and it really increases reader satisfaction if they can sort of glom onto what this person's role is in the story. So look it up if you want, the Jungian archetypes. Carl Jung was a philosopher. He's the one who sort of first really posited this idea that we have archetypes that are common to all of our different backgrounds and experience. So, but Jungian is spelled Jungian, and it's in my presentation, so you can see that if you want to look it up. So archetypes can also be bad. You don't want to have cardboard cutout characters. That's not the point of the archetype. The archetype is really just to sort of be like a piece of your overall character. So you want to avoid anything that's too pat, anything that's too cliche, and you can add complexity to an archetypal character who may be a secondary character, for example, by mixing up the archetypes a little bit. A good example of this might be Samwise Gamgee, another very nerdy reference to Lord of the Rings. He was sort of a wise leader, but also sort of the bumbling friend that needed to be taken care of. So, like, he was both, and that made him a much more three-dimensional character. Secondary character does not mean 2D, so be sure that your secondary characters are a little bit of a mishmash of things and not just serving the plot. Like, you do want to make sure that they have a little bit of depth to them as well. Once you get into like tertiary characters and walk-on characters, then those don't need as much depth. But secondary characters, sometimes secondary characters will totally sell your book, whereas your protagonist is just your protagonist. But like, one great example is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Like, I loved Willow and Xander and Spike and just everybody else much better than I love Buffy. I mean, she was great, but she wasn't the reason I watched that show. So I definitely recommend doing that. Beware of lazy writing. Development takes time and effort, but again, don't go overboard. So motivation informs character. So make sure that you have good motivation for your character, because that will help you determine what your character would do in any given situation and how they would react. So that can help sort of flesh out the archetype thing. So now, archetypes the ugly. This is probably the most important thing I'm going to tell you today. you've got to be aware of certain things when you're using archetypes to create your characters. You don't want to do any stereotyping. So, this is more for like when you're getting into the specific details, but just be very careful of including token characters in your story of like certain races or ethnicities, and really relying on stereotypes to develop those characters. You want to be very careful with how you deal with race issues and other minorities and ethnicities, that you don't that you tread very carefully so you don't offend people. Be careful of cultural appropriation. This is when you take symbols or things that really characterize a certain ethnicity and you appropriate them for your own uses, but without like any of the context around it, and maybe for your own benefit or for your character's own benefit, and not really without really taking into consideration being sensitive to that culture that you're borrowing from. So if you have any questions about that, you can also look that up. It's a thing. And just be careful of it. Another thing I want to talk about is strong female characters. This is cropping up a lot lately. We've got this thing called the Trinity Syndrome. That's from The Matrix, the character Trinity, where she comes in like bursting onto the scene, and she's like total, amazing, strong, wonderful character who seems to have everything on lockdown. She can take care of herself. And then for the rest of the movie, she's pointless. Like, she has absolutely no bearing on the plot except to give herself to the hero at the end as his love interest. So you want to avoid that. If you have strong female characters, definitely make them have a place in the plot beyond just victim or giving themselves to the hero or having the hero surpass them and in order to prove that he is amazing. So, just be careful with your strong female characters. A good example, the reverse example, would be Guardians of the Galaxy. I don't know if you guys have seen it yet, but it's awesome. The female character in that, her name is Gamora, and she definitely has a role in the plot that's vital from beginning to end. So, she's an example of a good, strong female character. You also want to be careful a little bit. This is sort of a strange thing, but it's something I've noticed cropping up a little bit lately. Kitchen sink diversity, I'm calling it, is where you throw in everything. Like, there's a disabled character, there's a black character, there's a gay character, there's, all these, mishmash of characters, and you're trying to address all of those issues throughout the book, and it's not even the main plot of the book. And that just seems like you're delving too much in all the issues all at once. To me, it seems like you're trying to sort of teach the readers a lesson about diversity. So be careful of that. You really don't want it to overshadow your plot. Again, plot is the important part. Diversity definitely has a big role. We need diverse books, and we need diverse characters just doing normal things in those books. Just so that people can, see themselves represented in their medium of choice. I absolutely 100% believe that. My books are very diverse, but just be careful that it doesn't come off as preachy, because then you'll lose your audience, and then you'll have, lost the whole point of what you were trying to do. So don't do that. Super secret author trick. Just do the best you can. I read this recently, and it's so, so true, that if you are born into privilege, if you are white, if you are, middle or upper class, then, people are going to hate on your book if it doesn't have diverse characters, or if it does and you do it poorly, or if it does and you do it well. They'll still hate on you because they think, oh, you did it well, but, what about all these authors who are diverse and they're not getting all of the attention that you are because you're white? And so really, there's not much you can do. And the place that I read this, it was a Tumblr thing that blew my mind, because at the very end it said, yeah, does that feel unfair to you, white people? Welcome to what it's like being a minority. Things are just unfair. And I think that's absolutely true. You know, it's just something that we have to live with as writers. We're going to do the best we can, and we're going to mess up sometimes. And sometimes we're going to get it right, and we're going to feel really good about that. And still, sometimes it's not going to be enough. And so we just have to keep trying and keep doing our best. So that's that. Um, and I apologize. I was not intending on using this computer, so I did not have my power cord ready. So I'm going to do that while I'm talking. So bear with me. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what's
It seems like Miss Summer is having a few technical difficulties on her end, so please bear with us as we try to get her reconnected. Thank you.
okay. I think we're back. I hope we're back because I'm going to keep talking. Okay. So sorry about that. What we were talking about is what's in a name. Um, so what's in a name for me? I think names that sound right are the most important. And the best example for this for me is my protagonist, Julep Dupree. I don't know where that name came from. I needed a name for her, and Julep just sounded cool. So I went with it, and then I built a story around it. That's really how I came up with Julep. All the other names were really just names that sounded right. Sam, I just wanted it to be a very simple name. Same with Tyler, I just wanted it to be very simple name. With Danny, since she's from the Ukraine and I didn't know anything about Ukraine names, I wanted something that was a feminine name that you could make sound masculine. And so I went to 20,000names.com. It's like 20,000 with a hyphen names.com, which is like my favorite go-to place for names, especially because they break it down by ethnicity, which I just love. And they have all the meanings right there too. And it's in alphabetical order, which I also love. So that's why I highly recommend that site for names. And I just looked at names until I found one that I liked the sound of it and I liked the meaning. And that's how I came up with Danny's name. So, you know, I do kind of pay a little attention to meaning, not a ton. Again, it's a time issue. You know, sure, you could find the perfect name for your secondary character that shows up for a total of 5 pages throughout the whole book, but you know, time is money. Like you gotta move in this business. It's only going to get faster, and so the faster you can write, the better. In my opinion, having now gone through 2 books, they want you to produce a book a year. That means writing a book in like 3 or 4 months tops. So it's important to learn speed to some extent. Avoid convoluted, hard to pronounce names. You don't want any reader going to your book and being like, oh man, this character's name is just so convoluted I can't even figure out who they are in the story every time their name comes up. You want somebody to be able to latch on to your character's name and be like, okay, Danny, easy, I know who that is. Sam, okay, I know who that is. By the same token, you don't want it to be too plain or to have too many names that are too plain. But that really goes to a number of characters' issues more than anything, and voice. But the convoluted names like that you see in like fantasy, or sometimes the historical books that go really into these convoluted names. Sure, you can have a glossary at the end, but not a lot of people are going to be that invested in your story to go look at the glossary to see how it's pronounced. Some big time fantasy writers can get away with that, but a new debut author, maybe, if everything else is wonderful. But in my experience, it's not really a good idea. So, and there are so many good names out there. You don't really need a big, 13 syllable convoluted name. Okay. Avoid naming people with names that start with the same letter. This is a problem that I had with my manuscript when I first wrote it, and one of my wonderful critique partners noticed it. It seemed like everybody's name started with M, and so I had to, and I wonder why that is. Maybe because my name starts with M. It was totally not on purpose, it just was. So I went in and I changed like 80% of the names to be something that was not starting with M. So don't do that. Super secret author trick is the 20,000 names website that I told you about. So I have it on here so that you guys can get that. Okay, so what's in a voice? Voice is huge. So there's author voice, and then there's the voices of your characters. And the voices, I'm going to focus on voices of your characters right now. Your author voice is something that sort of just develops over time. There's not, I don't think, anything you can really do except write a lot, and then you'll develop your author voice. But in terms of your characters' voices, you don't want them to sound all the same, and you don't want them to all sound like you. And it's very difficult to sort of figure this out. This is a sort of a more advanced concept for writing, but it's important, and it will make you stand out from other writers who just kind of everybody sounds the same. So what you want to do for this is you want to use your inner ear. This is like the hardest thing to develop, but you guys can do it. So when you develop a character, when you have this idea of who they are, you've created them, you've got, a wound for them, a skill, you have like this backstory idea of them, you know who they are. And so you will know what they sound like, if that makes any sense at all. When you approach a decision point or a clutch moment, or even just like talking to their friend, you'll be able to hear it in your ear if that's what they sound like, or if no, totally not, that's not how they sound. So it's just something to sort of pay attention to as you're going along, and that's same for the secondary characters too. Anybody who's speaking. But that being said, I'm not talking about accents. I'm not talking about like Hagrid here. You don't want to have something that's difficult, again, for the reader to read, because they'll get annoyed. And once it takes them out of the story, you've lost them. You want to keep them in the story. You want to like just grab their attention and not let go. And if they're having a hard time parsing what the character is saying, then you kind of got a problem. So some more about that. Think about the qualities of your character as you're writing them. Are they overly formal? When they're talking to people, then you might want to minimize contractions. Like, for example, my character Danny is from the Ukraine, and she doesn't know English that well, so she doesn't use contractions very often. I really try to avoid using contractions when I write her speech, and that makes her sound different than the other characters. Is your character from Alabama? You could use y'all occasionally, not all the time, but when it makes sense. And that will give a different flavor to your character's voice. It's a little bit accent, but it's not overwhelming. So, if you drop it in now and then, it sort of reminds me, oh yeah, this person is from Alabama. A great example of using words that are normal, but in a way that makes the voice just sing off the page is from the book The Help. It's written from the point of view of these black women who live in the Deep South and have their entire lives. And you can tell, I mean, none of the words are spelled funny, but the order in which they are put it just makes it like so clear who's talking. So you definitely, I would check that out if you're interested in learning how to, make a voice different. Another example is your character sardonic. Well, anytime that they're speaking to somebody, have them insult them, because that's pretty much what they would do. So, that's really how you make them sound different. So, super secret author trick, trust your revision process. I can't say this enough. When I write my first draft, often the characters sound wooden, they sound like me, they don't sound like themselves, and that's because I'm trying to figure out what happens from the beginning. Like, I'm writing for plot. When I go back in and revise, that's when I tweak how they say things to give them voices. So that is something there. So revealing character over time. This first one that I'm going to talk about is show, don't tell. This is, okay, the next two things that I'm going to tell you are really going to separate the people who are ready to be published and the people who are still beginning. And it's just a very obvious thing that once you hear it, you'll be like, oh, duh. But a lot of people just don't think about it. So when you are talking about your character and you're describing their image, the way they look, you definitely do not want to have them stand in front of a mirror and describe themselves ever. Like, it's, unless it is somehow very much relating to the plot, don't put them in front of a mirror in the morning and have them describe themselves, because that is lazy writing. You don't want to do it. It's pretty cliche. It's been done, and it's just not really how you do things anymore. Also, when you run into a new character, don't have your protagonist describe them. Don't have like a paragraph or two of description of this other character, especially if it's not relevant to what's happening in the moment, because that's pretty much the equivalent of having somebody just stand there and look at another person and nothing's happening. So you don't want to do that. It doesn't make sense to your plot. So don't just stand there and describe somebody. What you do want to do is you want to reveal those details as they're relevant to the action. So say that somebody is really tall, but you haven't told the reader that yet, and they happen to need to, for some plot reason, reach up to get something off of a shelf, and the shelf is like 7 feet high in the air or something. Then just have your protagonist turn to the really tall character and say, "You're like a behemoth, can you please get this down for me?" And then the reader is clued into the fact that they're tall. So that's, one way to do it. Another thing, super secret author trick, avoid describing eyes, hair, and height, especially when you're talking, like immediately introducing somebody, because those are not the things that you notice about somebody first. I mean, when was the last time you walked up and met somebody and immediately noticed their eye color? Like, it's not, unless their eye color is like vivid purple, you're not going to notice their eyes first. What you will notice is their posture, their gestures, their persona, what clothes they're wearing, what their expression is on their face, what their gait is if they're walking, if they slouch. You'll notice those things far sooner than you'll notice eye color. So just keep that in mind. Now I'm going to say tell, don't show. So I'm kind of contradicting myself a little bit, but for a reason. So when you have dialogue going on, or action really of any kind, but where your character is reacting in a scene, you don't want to rely on body parts to show emotion. This is something I am very guilty of, and it's okay to do it every once in a while. Like, my heart is in my throat, or my lungs constrict, or my guts are churning. Like, you can do that a little bit, but not a whole lot, because it gets well played out far sooner than you even think it's going to. So instead of doing that way to show emotion, allow your main character to actually tell their thoughts, their emotions, while they're moving through the setting and the plot. So this is called interiority or introspection, and you can really just tell more than you think you can about somebody's emotions. Don't say, "I feel blah blah blah," or "so and so felt such and such," if they're your main character. But you can you can work around it. You can think a little bit more deeply about what their emotions are and really dig into it and show it in a better light. I don't want to get into specific examples right now because that'd take a long time, but I did put a couple of things at the end, resources where you can blog posts that talk about it more specifically, and you can look at their examples, and because their examples are really good. They're far better than anything I could come up with anyway. So there you go. Super secret author trick: replace dialogue tags and filler action beats with telling thoughts or actions. So dialogue tags, he said, she said, you don't need them nearly as much as you think. You really only need them if there's confusion, like if there's more than one person speaking or somebody speaks out of turn and interrupts. Otherwise, you don't really need the he said, she said, and you definitely don't need like he exclaimed or she replied or he answered. You don't need any of those things. Some people fill that empty space with action beats, where, you know, like blah blah blah, you know, a person says, and then they like, I ran my fingers through my hair or something like that. So an action beat to sort of offset the he said, she said, make it not necessary. But you do want to kind of avoid filler action beats that don't really have a purpose. And you can replace that with like thoughts, you know, internal reactions that the characters are having to what's being said. You know, don't spell it all out for your reader, but you know, you can drop hints in there, and that's where some of the best storytelling takes place. So, you know, keep that in mind. Make sure that you're balancing all of those elements correctly. And again, you're not going to do this on your first try through the manuscript. Don't even try. Just get through the manuscript. You know, get through the story from beginning to end. And then when you're revising, you can think about these things. And you can ask your critique partners, you know, can you please look for this and suggest ways that I might, you know, fix it. Revision it's gold. That's where the real writing happens. Okay. So cause, effect, act, and react. What I said before about motivation informs character, that is absolutely true. And then character motivation informs action and reaction. So, and then the action and reaction reveals your character. So that's what you're kind of wanting to do, is like you're thinking about, okay, what does my character really want in this scene? You know, do they really just want to get away because they can't handle, you know, the emotional fallout from it? You know, then that informs what their action is going to be. They're going to run away. And then if they run away, that reveals their character is a little bit cowardly when it comes to emotional things. So you're revealing character through every action, which in turn comes from your character motivation from the beginning. So always know what your character wants in every scene. Also, along with that, super secret author trick, keep in mind what you want your reader to feel about your character in every given scene. So you keep in mind what your character is feeling and how they're going to react. But keep in mind that there's another person in all of this. It's the reader, and you want them to feel a certain way about your character based on what's happening here. So if it's early on in the book, the character is kind of not super sympathetic, then, you know, you have them run away, and you want the reader to feel not super sympathetic with the character, because you want the payoff at the end when the reader does feel super sympathetic with the character because they've changed. You know, just keep that in mind, that you're going for what you're going for your reader feeling about that character. So make sure your character's actions result in that way. So maybe they run away at the beginning, and your reader is like, oh man, that was kind of a cowardly thing to do. And then later on in the book, when they're faced with a very similar circumstance and they choose to stay and work it out, then that's a really big payoff for the reader, and the reader is like, yes, okay, I get it. I understand, you know, what's happening now with this character. So that leads me into character arc. Every character should have an arc. You know, in life, we're not the same from day to day. We're not the same at 10 that we were at 3. You know, we're not the same at 30 that we were at 10. We grow. And that's the same as true as of your character arc. And you want your character to grow over the course of the novel. And there are 3 ways they can do that. They can just change entirely. They can grow as as a person in in their own power, and it's their own. A lot of young adult novels kind of go on that. Or they can fall, like in Hamlet or something like that, where the character is going along, they're all dysfunctional, and then they fall. And that's sort of a tragedy, kind of a thing. Keep in mind for a series, this is why series are so difficult, there's a character arc for each book, and then there's an overall character arc. And then times that by the number of characters that you've got. So you've got to keep that in mind while you're doing a series. So, but you do have to stay true to your character, even if they do change, so that they are still, your character. They still have their voice, even though they are learning various things and growing and changing. So, super secret author trick, even though this is something that you should be aware of, it's not something you have to plan for. A lot of times characters just grow organically out of our stories, and that's the whole point of a story, is to show how a character grows over time. If tweaking is needed to your character arc, if you're like, oh gosh, they're just not growing enough, think about your theme and kind of revisit what your theme of your story is and see if that can help sort of help them grow by the end. So for example, in Trust Me, I'm Lying, the theme really is identity and who is Julep. And she doesn't know. And so by the end, she knows who she is. And that is really her growth thing for that book. Second book I'm still working on. But the first book, that is what her character arc is. So that's how she grows. Okay, so now really quickly, going through dialogue. Dialogue do's and don'ts. For do, watch a lot of television. This is the first and only time somebody's going to tell you to watch a lot of television. This is it. Watching a lot of TV will help you with your dialogue. It will get stuck in your ear. You'll have, a whole lot of language to draw from. Watch a lot of TV. Do skip a lot of pleasantries, inanities, and small talk. Don't talk about the weather unless it's somehow relevant to the characterization, which is relevant to the plot. You can break some of these rules, but just be careful where you do it. Don't do it a lot. But you don't need to say hello or goodbye, when you hang up the phone. Just pick up the phone and have them start talking. Don't do all of the normal things that you would do when you're talking on the phone. Weave threads of conversation together. You don't have to go in a straight line with conversation. I like to think about The West Wing. That is a great show to watch for dialogue, by the way. They were always on the move. They never had a conversation where they weren't moving. They were like always going from point A to point B because they were just very busy people, and they were having these great conversations while they were doing it. And you can do that with your characters. I certainly do it with mine. Helps increase pacing. But also you can weave threads of conversation together. So even if it's only two people, they can be talking about multiple things at one time. So keep that in mind, that they can it makes it for a more interesting dialogue if it's not just, one thread all the way through. Do skip dialogue tags. They use interiority instead. We talked about that. Super secret author trick. Reduce the amount of dialogue that you use. We don't talk as much as we think we do. So, keep the conversation short and to the point, don't meander. They shouldn't be paragraphs long. It's really just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Cutting is always the answer on that. For dialogue, don't use proper names unless it's during times of stress or heightened emotion. I often have to go back and take out proper names, because I don't know why. I just stick them in there. Maybe I have a lot of times of stress and heightened emotion, that's possible, but you don't often you're not talking to somebody and you say their name. That just doesn't happen very often. So it shouldn't happen in your book either. Don't forget about other characters that are present for the conversation. Make sure you weave them in, because very rarely are people just going to be sitting there watching two other people have a conversation. They're going to participate, so keep that in mind. Don't include any conversation that does not further the plot. It may be a glorious, wonderful, heartfelt conversation between two characters, but if it doesn't have some element of the plot in it, then it's extraneous, and it's going to slow the book down. Even if you just have the smallest, tiniest little bit of plot in there, that's enough. But you do need something. It kind of goes back to that using your scene to do 3 different goals. You just want to keep it very tight. So there's that. Super secret author trick, read all of your dialogue aloud. Stilted dialogue will sound stilted in your ear, and you can tell immediately if you read it aloud if it's going to work, if it's not going to work. So definitely do that. People will say, oh yeah, that's a great idea, I should definitely do that, and then don't do it. I know because I'm guilty of that. You should still do it. You should find a way to lock yourself in the bathroom or something and read it out loud. Okay, so Q&A. I've got a few questions from Alexis. I'm going to just answer really quickly. Why did you choose the character traits that you did for Julep? I wanted a female protagonist who was confident but unsentimental. And I wanted that because she's a con artist, and I figured a con artist would be unsentimental, like almost to the point of sociopath. So she's not that bad. But, you know, like they would be a little bit, you know, shadier on whether or not they cared what other people thought or how they felt. So I wanted her to be unsentimental and confident, and everything else just sort of stems from that. So because of that, you know, that sort of informs, like, you know, calling her friends minions and things like that. So how did you figure out how to name the characters? I kind of told you a little bit about that, just names that sounded right, and then looked up names that I needed help with. How do you keep the characters true to their characteristics? Again, revision is your friend. It's, you know, you will find out, and your critique partners will find out as they read, like, oh, this doesn't sound like Julep at all. And I mean, this happened to me in book 2. One of my critique partners was like, no, this is not Julep. And I had to go back and revise. And that's okay. Like, it's okay to revise. Nothing is set in stone, ever. So just keep that in mind. And I'm working on draft 4 of the 2nd book now. So that's just what you have to do. So anything else you want to ask me ever, you can email me directly if you want. My email address is maryelizabeth@mesummer.com. I think you'd also email Alexis. She would pass them on to me. And I have a bunch of resources, which I will send to you. So sorry again about the technical difficulties. At least it's not quite as bad as last time. And next time we will be talking about something, setting and research, I think. Okay, Alexis, over to you.
Thank you, Miss Mary Elizabeth, for yet another amazing presentation. And thank you all for watching. Have an amazing evening. Bye.